Why some people become happier after 60. At 72, Robert stopped caring what people thought of him. Not because he had become careless, not because he had stopped caring about other people. Something much more interesting had happened. He had finally learned the difference between being respected and being at peace. For most of his life, Robert had wanted to do things correctly. The right career, the right house, the right clothes, the right neighborhood, the right people around him. He wanted his children to be proud of him. He wanted his colleagues to respect him. He wanted his neighbors to think he was successful. He wanted to be the kind of man who seemed to have everything under control. And for decades, he succeeded. At 45, Robert became a senior executive. At 52, he bought a beautiful house. At 58, he had enough savings to feel secure. At 60, he retired. Everyone told him how fortunate he was. And they were right. Robert was fortunate. But something strange happened after retirement. The things that had once made him feel successful stopped making him feel happy. The expensive restaurant no longer mattered as much. The luxury car became just a car. The large house became something that needed maintenance. The impressive clothes stayed in the closet. The professional title disappeared. And the people he had spent years trying to impress were busy living their own lives. At first, Robert was confused. Then he began to understand. For most of his life, he had been asking one question: how will this look? Now he was asking something completely different. How will this feel? That small change transformed his life. When he was younger, Robert chose restaurants because they were impressive. Now he chose them because the food was good and the conversation was better. When he was younger, he traveled to places he thought he was supposed to visit. Now he traveled to places that genuinely interested him. When he was younger, he bought things that communicated success. Now he preferred things that carried memories. And when he was younger, he sometimes stayed in relationships because they looked good from the outside. Now he valued relationships that felt honest on the inside. Robert wasn't becoming less ambitious. He was becoming more selective. And this is one of the most interesting changes that can happen after 60. For some people, happiness doesn't decline with age. It becomes deeper. Not because life becomes perfect, not because problems disappear, not because aging is easy, but because priorities change. And when priorities become clearer, life can become lighter. For decades, Robert had believed happiness came from getting more money, more recognition, more success, more possessions, more approval. But eventually, he discovered something many people learn only after years of experience. More is not always better. Sometimes more is simply more. More things to maintain, more commitments, more expectations, more people to please, more reasons to worry. And sometimes, happiness begins when you stop adding and start choosing. Choosing what matters, choosing who matters, choosing where your attention goes, choosing what deserves your energy. When you're young, life can feel like a race. You compare yourself with classmates, then coworkers, then neighbors, then friends. Someone gets married, someone buys a house, someone gets promoted, someone starts a business, someone travels around the world, someone becomes wealthy. And without realizing it, you begin measuring your life against other people's lives. Robert did this for years. He had a colleague named Michael. Michael always seemed ahead. Bigger house, newer car, more expensive vacations, higher position. Robert never admitted it, but he compared himself to Michael constantly. If Michael bought something new, Robert noticed. If Michael received an award, Robert noticed. If Michael went somewhere impressive, Robert noticed. Robert's life was already good, but comparison made it feel smaller. Then, one afternoon, Robert and Michael met for lunch. Michael looked exhausted. He had recently been promoted. Everyone congratulated him. But when Robert asked how he was doing, Michael simply said, "I'm tired." Robert laughed. "You finally made it." Michael smiled. "That's the problem." Robert looked at him. Michael continued, "I spent 30 years trying to get here. Now I'm here and I'm wondering why I wanted it so badly." Robert didn't know what to say. That conversation stayed with him because he recognized himself in Michael. They had both spent years climbing a ladder, but neither had stopped often enough to ask whether the ladder was leaning against the right wall. Sometimes the most important question in life isn't, "Can I get there?" It is, "Do I actually want to go there?" After 60, many people finally become willing to ask that question. And when they do, something changes. The pressure begins to fall away. They stop needing to win every argument. They stop needing everyone to approve. They stop explaining every decision. They stop chasing invitations they don't enjoy. They stop pretending to like people they don't trust. They stop buying things simply because everyone else has them. They stop treating every social interaction like a performance. They become more comfortable saying, "This is what I like. This is what I don't like. This is what matters to me. And this is what no longer matters." That isn't selfishness, it is clarity. And clarity can be incredibly freeing. There was a time when Robert would spend an entire evening worrying about what someone thought of him. Now he could simply shrug and say, "They're allowed to think whatever they want." He discovered that other people's opinions were often much less important than he had imagined. Most people were too busy worrying about their own lives to spend much time thinking about his. That realization was liberating. Because so much of adulthood can be spent performing for an audience that isn't even watching. We dress for approval. We speak for approval. We work for approval. We buy for approval. We achieve for approval. And eventually, we become exhausted. The older we become, the more valuable authenticity can become. You begin to understand that pretending takes energy, and energy becomes precious. At 25, you may spend an entire evening at a party you don't enjoy because you're afraid of missing out. At 70, you may simply say, "No thank you," and go home. Not because you hate people, because you value your evening. You might sit on your porch, read a book, listen to music, call a friend, watch the sunset, and realize you are happier here. This is one of the quiet freedoms of aging. You become less interested in impressing strangers and more interested in enjoying your life. Robert discovered this while cleaning his closet. He found a suit he had purchased 20 years earlier. It had cost a lot of money. He remembered wearing it to an important event. At the time, he had felt incredibly proud. Now he held the jacket in his hands. He smiled. Then he put it into a donation box. He didn't need it anymore, but he kept something else. A faded sweater his wife had bought him years earlier. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't fashionable. It wasn't impressive. But it reminded him of a winter they had spent together. That sweater had more value to him now than the expensive suit ever had, because value changes when priorities change. A younger person might ask, "How much is it worth?" An older person may ask, "What does it mean to me?" That difference extends beyond possessions. It changes how people think about experiences. When Robert was younger, he wanted spectacular vacations. Now he enjoyed ordinary ones. A small town, a quiet hotel, a walk through an unfamiliar neighborhood, a local restaurant, a conversation with someone he had never met. He discovered that the best experiences weren't always the most expensive. Sometimes they were simply the ones where he was fully present. This is another reason some people become happier after 60. They become better at appreciating ordinary moments. A cup of coffee tastes different when you aren't rushing. A walk feels different when you aren't trying to get somewhere. Dinner feels different when the phone is away. A conversation feels different when you aren't thinking about your next meeting. Sunlight through a window can suddenly feel beautiful. Rain can become something to listen to rather than something to complain about. The ordinary becomes visible. And once the ordinary becomes visible, life contains far more beauty than you expected. But there is another reason happiness can increase with age. You know yourself better. When Robert was 30, he was still trying to figure out who he was. He tried different careers, different hobbies, different social groups, different versions of himself. Some worked, some didn't, but every experience taught him something. By 70, he knew what drained him. He knew what energized him. He knew which environments he enjoyed. He knew which people brought peace. He knew which conversations he wanted to have. And he knew which ones he didn't. Self-knowledge reduces unnecessary struggle. You stop forcing yourself into lives that don't fit. You stop comparing your personality with someone else's. You stop asking why you aren't more like them. You begin asking, what works for me? That question is powerful. Maybe you don't want a large social circle. Maybe you prefer 3 close friends. Maybe you don't want to live in a busy city. Maybe you prefer a quiet town. Maybe you don't want to attend every gathering. Maybe you prefer smaller conversations. Maybe you don't want to work until 70. Maybe you want to spend more time with family. Maybe you want to learn something completely new. At a certain age, you realize that your life doesn't need to look impressive. It needs to feel meaningful. Robert's friend Margaret discovered this in a different way. For years, she had been known as the person who never said no. If someone needed help, she helped. If someone invited her somewhere, she went. If someone asked for a favor, she agreed. People loved her, but she was exhausted. After 65, she started changing. She didn't become cruel, she simply became honest. She began saying, I can't do that. I need a quiet day. I'd rather stay home. I don't agree. I need help. At first, she worried people would become upset. Some did. But something surprising happened. The relationships built on genuine affection became stronger. The relationships that depended on constant availability began to disappear. And Margaret realized something. Losing a relationship that only survives when you abandon yourself isn't always a loss. Sometimes it is freedom. This is why emotional boundaries can become easier and more important later in life. You begin to recognize that peace has value. Not everything deserves a response. Not every insult deserves an argument. Not every disagreement needs to be resolved. Not every person needs to understand you. You don't have to attend every fight you are invited to. You don't have to prove that you are right. You don't have to convince everyone that you are a good person. You can simply live according to your values and walk away from unnecessary noise. This can create a surprising kind of happiness, a quieter happiness, a more stable happiness, a happiness that doesn't depend entirely on what happens outside you. But there is something else that changes after 60. You begin to understand that time is not just something you have, it is something you spend. When you're young, time feels abundant. You can postpone things. You can say, I'll do it next year. I'll call them later. I'll travel someday. I'll spend more time with my parents when life slows down. But eventually, you understand that someday is not guaranteed. Robert learned this when his older brother died unexpectedly. They had always talked about taking a trip together. Every year they said they would do it. Next summer, after work settled down, after the children finished school, after retirement, they kept postponing. Then one morning, Robert received a phone call. His brother was gone. The trip never happened. Robert carried that regret for years, but the experience changed how he treated time. He stopped saying someday so often. If he wanted to see someone, he made the call. If he wanted to travel, he planned the trip. If he wanted to learn something, he started. If he loved someone, he told them. Not because he became afraid of death, but because he became more respectful of life. That is another gift of aging. You become more aware of limits, and limits can make things more valuable. A sunset is beautiful partly because it ends. A vacation matters partly because it doesn't last forever. A conversation becomes precious because the people we love are not guaranteed to be here forever. When you understand this, you begin paying closer attention. And attention is one of the foundations of happiness. You cannot appreciate what you don't notice. You cannot enjoy a moment you are mentally absent from. You cannot experience closeness while constantly thinking about the next thing. So Robert began practicing something simple: presence. When he ate, he ate. When he walked, he walked. When someone spoke, he listened. When his grandchildren visited, he put his phone away. He wasn't perfect, but he became better at being where he was, and the more present he became, the richer ordinary life felt. There is also a deeper reason some people become happier after 60. They become less afraid of imperfection. When you're young, you may believe you need to have everything figured out. You think successful people know exactly what they're doing. You think happy people don't struggle. You think strong people don't cry. You think confident people never doubt themselves. Age teaches you otherwise. You have watched people succeed and fail. You have watched marriages begin and end. You have watched careers rise and disappear. You have watched people change. You have watched yourself change. And eventually, you realize that nobody has everything figured out. Everyone is improvising. Everyone is carrying something. Everyone has regrets. Everyone has fears. Everyone has experienced moments they wish they could change. This realization can make you more compassionate toward others and toward yourself. Robert became much less critical of his younger self. He had made mistakes, plenty of them, but he realized that the younger version of himself had been doing the best he could with the knowledge he had at the time. He couldn't change those years, but he could stop punishing himself for them. Self-forgiveness became part of his happiness, and perhaps this is one of the most important lessons of growing older. You cannot change your past, but you can change your relationship with it. You can stop reliving old arguments. You can stop wishing you had made different choices. You can learn from your mistakes without allowing them to become your identity. You can say, "I wish I had done that differently," and then, "But I am still here." That sentence contains enormous power. I am still here. There are still mornings, still conversations, still possibilities, still people to love, still things to learn, still places to see, still ways to contribute, still time to become kinder, still time to become wiser, still time to live differently. This is why age should not be viewed only as a countdown. It can also be a clarification. The older you become, the clearer the unnecessary things can become. You don't need every opportunity. You don't need everyone's approval. You don't need to win every argument. You don't need to own everything. You don't need to know everything. You don't need to prove your worth. You need enough. Enough health to enjoy the day, enough people to love, enough purpose to get out of bed, enough curiosity to keep learning, enough peace to appreciate the quiet, enough courage to be yourself, and enough gratitude to recognize what you already have. Robert eventually stopped calling retirement retirement. He called it his second chapter. He began learning photography. He had always wanted to take photographs but never had the time. At first he was terrible. The pictures were ordinary, sometimes blurry, sometimes poorly framed. But he didn't care. That was the point. For the first time in his life he was doing something without needing to be good at it. He wasn't trying to build a business. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't trying to win. He was simply curious. And curiosity brought something back into his life that achievement had slowly pushed aside. Play. The freedom to do something because it is enjoyable. Children understand this naturally. Adults often forget. Children draw because they like drawing. They build things because they enjoy building. They ask questions because they want to know. Somewhere along adulthood we begin asking, what's the point? What if the point is simply that you enjoy it? What if not everything has to produce something? What if some experiences are valuable because they make you feel alive? After 60, many people rediscover this. They garden, they paint, they cook, they walk, they read, they dance, they travel. They learn languages, they play music, they volunteer, they spend time with family, they become students again. And they discover that life becomes richer when curiosity returns. Robert's photography eventually led him to a local walking group. That walking group introduced him to new people. Those people invited him to dinner. One of them became a close friend. That friend introduced him to a volunteer project. The volunteer project gave him a new sense of purpose. One small decision created another. That is how a new chapter often begins. Not with a dramatic transformation, with a small yes. Yes to the walk. Yes to the class. Yes to the conversation. Yes to trying something you are not good at. Yes to meeting someone new. Yes to beginning again. Sometimes the best part of getting older is discovering that you are still capable of surprise. You may know yourself better, but you don't have to stop growing. You can become a new version of yourself, not because your old self was wrong, because life keeps changing, and you can change with it. Robert eventually understood something else. Happiness after 60 isn't about pretending that aging has no difficulties. There are losses, there are physical changes, there are people you miss, there are doors that close, there are moments of loneliness. There are fears about the future, but happiness doesn't require the absence of difficulty. It requires meaning strong enough to coexist with difficulty. A person can be sad and still grateful, lonely and still hopeful, older and still curious, afraid and still courageous. This is a deeper form of happiness. It doesn't depend on everything going right. It depends on knowing what makes life worth living. And perhaps that is the real secret. When you are young, happiness can feel like something that happens to you. A promotion, a new relationship, a trip, a purchase, a success. Later in life, happiness becomes more intentional. You build environments that support peace. You choose relationships carefully. You make time for what matters. You reduce unnecessary stress. You practice gratitude. You stay connected. You continue learning. You serve others. You create meaning. Happiness becomes less about luck and more about how you live, because the most impressive life is not necessarily the happiest. A person can have a huge house and feel lonely. A person can have a modest home and feel deeply loved. A person can have a prestigious career and feel empty. Another person can spend their days helping others and feel incredibly fulfilled. A person can have thousands of acquaintances and no true friend. Another can have 2 close friends and feel rich beyond measure. Happiness isn't always visible from the outside. Sometimes the happiest life looks ordinary, and perhaps that is why we miss it. We are trained to admire spectacular lives, but happiness often lives in quiet places: a kitchen table, a garden, a walk, a phone call, a shared meal, a book, a familiar song, a hand on your shoulder, a friend who remembers, a child who visits, a peaceful mind. The older you become, the more valuable these things can feel, because you begin to understand that life isn't made primarily of milestones. It is made of moments between milestones, and those moments are your life. So if you are over 60, don't assume happiness belongs to the young. It doesn't. Youth has its gifts, but age has gifts of its own. You may have less energy than before, but perhaps more wisdom, less time, but more appreciation, fewer relationships, but deeper ones, fewer possessions that matter, but more memories, less desire to impress, but more freedom to be yourself. You may have fewer answers, but better questions, and sometimes better questions are more valuable than easy answers. What do I really value now? Who do I want beside me? What do I want to stop doing? What do I want to begin? What deserves my attention? What deserves my forgiveness? What makes me feel alive? What kind of person do I want to become in the years ahead? Those questions can open a new chapter. Not a perfect chapter, a meaningful one. And perhaps the greatest lesson is this: you don't have to wait until 60 to stop living for other people's approval. You don't have to wait until retirement to slow down. You don't have to wait until a crisis to appreciate your relationships. You don't have to wait until you lose something to recognize its value. You can begin now. Put down the phone. Call someone you love. Take the walk. Wear the clothes you actually like. Visit the place you've been postponing. Learn the thing you've always been curious about. Say no when you mean no. Say yes when your heart says yes. Stop explaining yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Spend less time performing and more time living. Because life is not a stage where everyone is watching. Most people are busy with their own stories. You are allowed to step away from the performance. You are allowed to live quietly. You are allowed to choose meaning over status, peace over competition, connection over appearance, experience over possessions, presence over productivity, and happiness over approval. Robert learned this at 72. But the truth is, he could have learned it at 30. So could Margaret. So could Michael. So could any of us. We don't need to wait for age to teach us what attention can teach us today. Life is happening now, not after the next promotion, not after the next purchase, not after retirement, not after everyone approves. Now. And maybe the secret of becoming happier after 60 is not that older people discover a completely new form of happiness. Maybe they simply stop overlooking the happiness that was already there. They notice the morning, They notice the people. They notice the quiet. They notice the laughter. They notice the memories. They notice their own life. And they finally understand that a meaningful life does not have to impress anyone. It only has to be lived honestly. One day, Robert's grandson asked him, "Grandpa, what's the best thing about getting old?" Robert thought for a moment. He could have talked about experience, wisdom, freedom, retirement. But instead, he smiled. "The best thing," he said, "is that you finally understand what isn't worth worrying about." His grandson laughed. "What isn't worth worrying about?" Robert looked toward the sunset. "What people think," he paused. "Because eventually you realize they weren't thinking about you nearly as much as you thought they were." His grandson laughed again. Robert smiled. Then he added, "And once you stop trying to impress everyone, you finally have time to enjoy the people you actually love." The sun disappeared behind the trees. The evening became quiet, and Robert sat there, not trying to become anyone else, not trying to prove anything, not trying to win, just living. And perhaps that is the real secret. Happiness doesn't always come from adding something to your life. Sometimes it comes from removing the things that were preventing you from enjoying it. Less comparison, less approval seeking, less clutter, less resentment, less pretending, less rushing, and more presence, more gratitude, more curiosity, more connection, more meaning, more life. Because growing older is not simply about losing the things you once had. It can also be about gaining the freedom to decide what matters now. And when that freedom arrives, some people discover something beautiful. They are not becoming less interested in life. They are becoming more interested in the right life. The life that feels true. The life that feels peaceful. The life that contains people they love. The life that leaves room for wonder. The life that doesn't need an audience. And perhaps that is why some people become happier after 60. They finally stop living for the life that looks good and start living for the life that feels good. And when you stop trying to impress the world, you may finally have enough attention left to enjoy your own life.